background why we chose that specific title. The idea was that sort of the notion of a part of the distribution network that can disconnect from the bulk power grid is really a technology that within the last 1 or 2 years emerged from a niche application to a set of technologies that is now discussed in a much wider context of grid modernization and as a solution for many challenges at the grid edge. And that includes PV integration. It of course includes enhanced reliability needs against the background of Hurricane Sandy along the East Coast, for example. But it also includes increased energy efficiency needs and cost reduction, achieving cost reduction goals. So what I think is really interesting about the panelists here is that we have very different perspectives on the different opportunities of the microgrid market. So I'm going to start by giving you a bit more detail about the panelists. I also want to say that I think we have varying levels of optimism about the microgrid market here, so it should make for an interesting discussion. I'll start with Tim Qualheim. He's the Vice President of Strategic Solutions at S&C Electric, a company that brings switching and protection expertise to the microgrid market, but also has deployment experiences with battery management systems in the microgrid context. Bob Yinger is a consulting engineer for Southern California Edison, has been with the utility for over 3 decades, and has been involved in research and development projects, and especially systems planning. One of the main projects you've been working on is the Irvine Smart Grid demonstration projects, and I think we're also going to have the time to touch on some of the technologies there and their applicability in the microgrid space. Terry Mohn is the CEO of General Microgrids, a company that designs microgrids and business strategies for microgrids. He's also the chairman of the United Nations Foundation Working Group on Microgrids, and therefore an interesting panelist because he has both international experience for sort of off-grid solutions as well as a view on the domestic market in the US. Antoine Paquin is the CEO and president of Solantro, a semiconductor company that sells chipsets for power conversion as well as power management platforms, and has the distinct goals, Antoine told me, to significantly drive down the cost of power electronics in microgrids. Craig Wilkins is the chairman and founder of Vision Energy, a rather young company, a storage provider that recently came to market with a grid-scale zinc redox flow battery, and is targeting both the utility market as well as off-grid solutions. So I'd like to start off by looking at sort of the present stage of the market and some of the more interesting recent developments along the East Coast after Hurricane Sandy. So we see states like Connecticut and New York putting grant money towards microgrids. So I wanted to ask you, Terry, first, to sort of put this into a larger perspective for us. So what roles can states play in terms of not only giving the market a push in terms of critical facility microgrids, but also in terms of promoting commercial microgrids?
Great, thank you, Magdalena. Thank you for inviting me to this event. Very much look forward to discussing this further, particularly with my esteemed colleagues. We see a huge rise in interest in investments in microgrids, and we've seen actually a number of presentations yesterday and today where various microgrid projects are being discussed. We see them now coming about at the state level, which is kind of odd, really. I think it's a reaction to perhaps perception that utilities are not as responsive to customer needs as they could be, and the states are making money available to explore whether third-party investment in microgrids makes sense. If you look at the microgrid market today, particularly domestically, I think by and large, if not 90 to 95% of those microgrids are research projects. We see a lot of the technologies that exist in those microgrids have been perhaps donated, particularly with university projects. We see a lot of donated equipment, and it requires a tremendous amount of engineering to make these systems actually operate. If microgrids become a commodity market, we have to transition away from engineering each one uniquely and being a very kind of an engineering design to more of a standardized approach. One of the other roles that I have is I support NIST. I'm a federal advisor to NIST standard smart grid investment panel activities. And we just had our annual event, our annual planning activity, and there are two main themes for this year's objectives within NIST. Number one is cybersecurity, come up with a good series of standards for cybersecurity for the utility sector. And number two is develop the standards for microgrids. I think that's critical in achieving a wholesale growth in this market. But it's interesting to see that the states are making funding available to exercise some of these experiments. You'll see that the RFPs that they're issuing are requesting as much of a standardized approach as possible. Unfortunately, they're not going to find many. I think those are still going to be largely experiments as well. When we get into it, I can talk about the international market as well. That kind of leads into this.
No, I think what I found very interesting is that you said many of the existing projects still have a very distinct research and demonstration focus. So that sounds like there is still a large set of barriers to further deployment of commercial microgrids. And when we did our research in the past couple of months, the number of commercial microgrids in the US that we actually found was very few, less than 10% of the current market in terms of capacity. And I think there's a notion out there, and something that also vendors agree upon, is that there's a certain amount of building blocks for microgrids that are already out there, including distributed energy resources, microgrid controllers, switching and protection equipment. So the question for me is it the sort of the remaining step to faster market growth? Is that more of a regulatory and legal question, or is it still a technology question? So would you agree with saying it's more on the legal and regulatory side, or is there still technological building blocks that are missing?
Well, I would offer that if utilities make the investment, there's no regulatory issue at all. If it's a third-party commercial investment, it probably is still not a regulatory issue unless it starts to connect to the grid and offer resources. And even then, I would question how you would describe the regulatory involvement in that, because you're more or less selling a commodity back to either the distribution operator or to the wholesale operator. And there's specific rules on interconnect and specific rules on the transaction in place. Feed-in tariffs is a good example. So I would say that it's really too early to think about the discussion of regulation for microgrids. I think when we see a large growth in that market, perhaps we can have that conversation, but it's still a couple of years away.
Okay, and I think Antoine, as a tech provider, you would probably agree that there is still technological building blocks that you could provide and would like to sell, I suppose.
Absolutely. I actually was going to ask if it's okay to give a hug to Terry here.
Sure, please go ahead.
Driving the point of the requirement for deep commoditization. Microgrids is an early market. It's actually an R&D market today, and I would agree fully with that. It requires a lot of upfront engineering. Requires a lot of planning. It's very expensive. Probably most of the cost, if I'm not mistaken, would come from the human side, the professionals, engineering, and the like. I think the requirement will be for the, and it is for very specific assets that need to be protected. But like all markets, the more you make it cheap, the more you make it interoperable, the more you commoditize the hardware and allow for system integration to become the focus via standards bodies and others, that you're going to get to smaller and smaller microgrids to the point where they become nanogrids. And these nanogrids don't have to be perfectly engineered. They can be self-discovered, self-configurable, self-islanded, and even route energy between each other. So ultimately, we're in the business of driving this type of commoditization via power electronics, and partnering with industry vendors to drive interoperability and standards behind that adoption.
I think a lot of the building blocks, if you like, exist in the world today. I mean, you've got storage, you've got generation, you have switchgear. I think it's really the integration of those pieces that's really lacking. And I think, Antoine, you talked about a little bit with sort of standards would certainly help make that job a lot easier, because everyone I've seen have been custom engineered, and that's a very expensive process, and just all the parts you need to make the integration go well. I think a lot of the projects we've seen come across our desks, from the utility standpoint, are not really microgrids in the sense that I don't really expect them to be able to seamlessly island from the grid on an outage. And they may be able to support load at some point, but they're not designed to sort of seamlessly island. There are some cases that you do that, but in most cases it's more of a financial play, I think, around optimizing generation that you can generate locally, maybe at a lower cost at certain times, and then at other times you can buy it more cheaply off the grid, so you sort of play with that trade-off.
One of the things that I've seen in this market, what you're just describing, is the vendors that come in and offer a microgrid solution for even a utility have core competencies in certain areas, but because their partnership isn't broad enough to cover all the other elements that go into a microgrid, these core competencies are kind of diluted, where the vendor will say, well, we can do these other activities too, but that's not their domain of expertise, and they kind of bumble around in getting the rest of the microgrid built out. When we get into a standards environment, we'll see multiple providers in each of those niches, and competition will drive the cost down, but also make it easier for organizations to be very specialized in what they do well.
You guys talk a little bit about regulation. You talked a little bit about the cost. I'm probably the panel member up here who's not as bullish on microgrids as some of the others are, at least near term. And I think the real reasons are, today when people want to put in a microgrid or are thinking about putting in a microgrid, there's really, unless it's a military base or a government university or something, the real drivers are either cost, as in my electricity cost is way too high, or my reliability is really poor and I got to find a way to get my reliability up. So the kind of projects that we've seen, they pretty well mirror what's been discussed. They've been a lot of military, hospital, university, healthcare, that kind of thing. But there's been very little commercial, and the few that have been commercial, and one was a jail where they really felt like they kind of had to keep the power on to keep the jail doors closed. So to me, the real drivers right now are, it has to do with the cost, but it also has to do with the thing penciling out, period, for the company that wants to put it in. I mean, if I'm an industrial and my business is pumping out PVC pipe, I'm not sure I really even want to have a microgrid unless it's going to save me a lot of money, because my business is making sure that I'm making good PVC pipe, for example.
Since you mentioned Santa Rita Jail, and Santa Rita Jail has a really large-scale battery system, so I wanted to bring in Craig in the conversation. Storage can do so much for microgrid economics, and you said part of the vision of Vision Energy is to sort of redefine battery storage economics. Can you elaborate a little bit about what that means in a microgrid context?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've seen, and part of the whole problem that I've seen within the whole microgrid environment, is every battery manufacturer says I'm PCS agnostic and application software agnostic. Every power conversion system company say I'm battery agnostic. And eventually someone's going to have to get married in this process because the process of that integration and getting a turnkey system solution to a customer just can't continue to be a one-off exercise every time you turn around. So really what we, from our battery side, as much as we understand the US base and the microgrids, I decided to chase microgrids before they were cool. Even before Fukushima happened, the one reason we went after the microgrid market, it was the one place that I knew that by replacing diesel with a renewable and the battery, I was going to be in the ballpark to provide an economic return. And what we found in an environment like that, a microgrid is a very aggressive environment on a battery. And a battery goes through a pounding that it doesn't if it's a UPS backup system or it's doing some type of ancillary service support, but it's not really meeting the full demands of balancing that supply and demand. So we designed our battery, which is it's a flow battery system, so everyone says, oh great, you're an energy battery system. We had to redesign and re-engineer and reinvent the flow battery to be able to provide power services. And when we found out that we were able to do that, I think we started being able to meet the economics of the microgrid and deliver what I determined was an adequate return to the customer so that they would take the leap of faith into the new technology. So I couldn't reduce their power consumption or their energy cost by 10% and say take a leap on a new technology. We had to do something a little more earth-shattering to start showing at least a 25% rate of return on a project for them to even put their eyeballs on it. And that's hard to do. and you're not going to do it in most of the projects in the United States where a lot of the cool things are being started. So we're doing most of our stuff offshore.
Okay, yeah, because I was going to add that when we look at sort of operational microgrid capacity in the US, the majority of the projects that have battery storage was installed within the past 3 years. So first of all, it's a fairly recent phenomenon, and also it's still it's smaller than 1/3 of the total microgrid projects in the US have any battery storage installed at all. So I was going to ask you, do you see regional conditions under which solar, PV, and storage-based microgrids could gain significant traction in the US as well, and not only in environments where you have 35 cents, 40 cents of electricity costs?
It's when you start factoring in long-term reliability, and when you start looking at the reconfiguration of a fully central generation system to a distributed generation system, it's not going to happen without a battery. It's the glue that's going to end up making that thing come together. So however all that stuff comes together, until there is an economic viable solution, I think it'll continue to struggle to find foothold here. I think we've created artificial demand with some of these grant proposals and RFOs, and everyone's all fired up and excited. And while everyone is looking at California, New York, and up in Canada now and Hawaii, I've stayed focused on the Hawaii and the Caribbean and the areas where there's a true pain point. There's not enough pain in America. We see Hurricane Sandy, and pretty soon LIPA's putting out a 12-hour battery requirement, and everyone kind of shakes their head and says, what? The issue is there's not enough pain point here right now because we've got a pretty good, reliable grid. But as things change and things evolve and more renewables brought into it, there's additional balances and supports that are going to have to support higher penetration of renewables and the changeover in the grid.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to also promote a little bit more optimism about the market in the US, and sort of I think we agree on the fact that it's still fairly early stage, but at the same time there is a significant number of deployments and there is some lessons learned. So I wanted to sort of come back to the question of more standard approaches to certain types of solutions, and also ask you, Terry, because you told me when we talked before the conversation that there is a certain type of standard approaches to off-grid solutions that you've been deploying in emerging markets. So I was wondering what is sort of the intersecting set between those and the US market?
One thing that we haven't done very well, particularly at this panel, but maybe in other panels, is really describe the really cool characteristics of microgrids. A microgrid, I've said this a number of times in various events, a microgrid is the smart grid killer app. But you need smart grid as a foundation. But why do we care about smart grid in this killer app? With looking at the concentrated load in a geographic space that a microgrid kind of contains, you have generation capacity and you have load, and that generation capacity, as was just mentioned, could be a renewable generation source. It could be a hybrid, but typically it's a renewable generation source. And when there's abundant generation, you want to consume all that you have. And when there's not an abundant supply, you kind of curtail load, use demand response or control strategies. What's really cool about this is the way in which utilities work today is they always operate with a reserve margin. Even in distribution, there's always some gap between available capacity and load. And there's a swing in that margin. With a microgrid and smart grid technologies, you crush that margin to absolutely minimum. And what happens as a result of that is the overall investment for the entire distribution system that is the microgrid is much smaller per unit. So in overall, a microgrid has a characteristic of managing load, managing supply, and balancing that and providing the financials that minimize that investment and still provide the guarantees that are needed by the operation. Now, if we can do this really well, this market is huge, not only in the US, but absolutely internationally. I work with the UN. As a matter of fact, we have a project in India right now where we're working with the Minister of Power to figure out how do we attract the commercial market players into India and sell into building microgrids for 300 million people, a little bit shy of the population of the US. 300 million people in India have no access to energy, but the government wants them to have access to energy so their economy can thrive. Well, guess what? The U.S. economy can thrive too. We can sell those goods and commodities, but we're not ready. Our industry is not ready to deliver those as shrink-wrap solutions. That's just 1/4 of the overall market share for microgrids outside the domestic U.S. So if we get really good at building microgrids in the next 4 or 5 years in developing countries where the risk is absolutely minimal, we can make mistakes, we don't have the regulatory barriers that we have here in the States. We get really good at that as an industry, bring that capability back to the U.S. in the next 4 or 5 years, and we can really compete well with reliable grid, stable energy production, if not even improve it. But it doesn't have to be without the utility. I always thought that the utility would be involved in microgrid deployments and maybe even become investors or implementers. So what we want to do is we want to shape the technology portfolio that addresses the market, perhaps experiment a little bit outside the U.S., get really good at that experiment, bring it back to the U.S., and have capabilities that are very reliable, that they're industrial grade, they're utility grade, and they become commercially grade.
So yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the role of utilities and also bring Bob in the conversation. So I think we agree on the fact that if we want to build more of those smart grid killer apps in the long run on a broad implementation base, we're going to need the utilities on board. So I wanted to ask you, where do you see the role of utilities in sort of helping to deploy more microgrids, and also sort of twisting the perspective a little bit around what can microgrids do for utilities?
Yeah, microgrids, I mean, utilities have a sort of a mandate to serve all the customers in their service area. That's a piece of the franchise you get when you become a regulated utility. So when a utility planner looks at microgrids and other resources, they say, okay, we need to still meet all of the customers' requirements. So to the extent that a microgrid can help that, that's a good thing. To the extent that you still need to plan for the microgrid, and the microgrid that Terry describes is actually kinds of things that we'd love to see in a microgrid. Most of the time they don't really operate that way. Most of the time they're more of an economics play, but I think the utility, if they can't rely on the fact that that microgrid will only supply or only require a certain amount of load off the grid, and you don't have to plan for the fact that maybe the microgrid generation goes out and then they want to draw power from the grid, which forces us to actually plan for that case. So, I mean, that's sort of our dilemma right now, is that we need to be able to plan for the case where those microgrids might require generation.
But now, may I ask, sorry, at this point, have microgrids actually become an integral part of utility system planning at this point?
There's so few of them at this point, no, it has not. And like I say, most of the projects that call themselves microgrids really are not designed to seamlessly island and do the kinds of things that most of us think about when we think about microgrids. They're really in there certain times of the day, they'll buy power, other times of the day they'll self-generate. So we need to still plan for that capacity on our system. So we can't not plan for that and still maintain the safe and reliable grid that we need to maintain with our, from our franchise. So that's kind of our dilemma from a utility standpoint. If you go back to the basic definitions, I mean, the CERTS folks did work 10, 12 years ago, and it was sort of this controllable load that faces the grid, and it always looks like a kind of a constant requirement or constant interconnect. Those would be a lot easier to plan for. We'd like that. But I haven't seen that really materialize yet. I think that may come about, and I think it's sort of this whole integration and control piece that's not really quite there yet, that we need to get through before we can kind of move into that area.
But would you agree, at least the conversation has been started, that 3 years ago the utilities weren't even having that discussion? We thought we were going to have to build our business on all the doomsday preppers, trying to totally isolate themselves. But we've had discussions with Encore in Texas and with FP&L, and you're starting to actually have the discussion. So at least there's eyeballs on it, whereas before it was kind of brushed aside.
Yeah, it's an interesting comment, because I've worked in the sort of the research side of Southern California Edison for 37 years now. And we started doing solar and wind work and looking at integration issues 25, 30 years ago. And so we've been working in this area. As I mentioned, we were part of the CERTS microgrid project in 1998, 1999 to start looking at how these things come together. So it's not new to a utility, but I just don't think that we saw the market there. We didn't see our customers really clamoring for it. I think the cost side just scared people away.
Yeah.
And I think the utility role could potentially be as a way of some of these microgrids maybe sharing ancillary services or something between them, or something so they could support each other in some normal operations. It could be useful in that respect.
Well, that's exactly what New York is trying to do right now. If you look at the New York filing, they're trying to look at alternate ways of providing resources to stabilize the grid. And one of them is treating distributed resources as a virtual attribute for the operation of the grid. Now, I think they're going a little bit, I think New York is going a little bit too far in their definition of this because it kind of excludes the capabilities that a microgrid can bring. They're looking at how do you bring any type of distributed resource in and make that as a resource into the wholesale market in a virtual way. It overlooks the capabilities that a microgrid can offer a local utility, which is provide added reliability to just the distribution circuit that they have completely overlooked. But I wanted to get to a point that you make about questioning the value of rate basing a microgrid. The utility has to solve the distributed generation problem anyway, and that investment will come whether you put batteries in neighborhoods or whether you have cap banks that you install, but it's specifically for neighborhoods, because those are the neighborhoods that have the high net worth, they have solar on the rooftops, they have the EVs, and they're the ones that are exacerbating the operation of the distribution circuit the worst. So you have to make an investment anyway. You end up rate basing that investment today. So why wouldn't you look at rate basing a microgrid in lieu of those other types of investments? I think it's just a counterpoint to what you're saying.
Wouldn't you agree that the average microgrid investment is still higher on a per kilowatt basis than other distribution network upgrade investments or smart grid investments? So my question is sort of
There's still experiments.
How do you factor in that extra reliability that you create by being able to island into a business case or something that creates a revenue stream, not in a 10 years timeout?
Well, the market isn't ready for that answer. I think we'll be ready in a couple of years. The whole hope here is that we develop a commercial grade microgrid that is financeable, and whether it's owned and operated by the utility or owned and operated by a third party can be decided, once we've developed the capabilities. But we're not there yet. I mean, even if you take a look at the DoD installations for microgrids, DoD can spend whatever they need to build a microgrid. There's no business case from a commercial supplier and owner-operator perspective.
Antoine, in terms of cost reduction opportunities, how does your technology fit into that goal?
I think there's an issue of technology, but also an issue of expectation behind what you want out of a microgrid. It is true that if it's rate-based, you have to meet all sorts of load demands that cover a wide range of perspectives, and that from that perspective, you're a lot more expensive to start with anyway to cover all the cases. We tend to look at microgrids more from the point of view of protecting critical loads behind the meter, whether it be on an industrial scale, commercial, or residential scale. And in that case, I think the economics for microgrids, especially as you diminish the capital equipment of the hardware, the batteries, which are critical to it all, and the third factor being load shedding, if you accept the compromise that comes with just operating critical loads on a prioritized basis, that microgrids can actually be exceptionally cost-effective with the right type of commoditization behind the hardware and interoperability between the vendors. So it's really an issue of both technology and expectations of what you want from the end user.
And you mentioned also when we talked before the conversation that you're working with the Canadian government right now on sort of microgrids in the kilowatt range. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
We are, and I'll be deeply interested in talking to Terry after this. What we're looking at is more of an approach to bottom-up electrification, where you can have self-assembled nanogrids that can be dynamically scaled unplanned from 1 to 10 kilowatts each variable loads with battery storage and prioritized demand response, but also the ability to route traffic between these nanogrids so that you can have the ability of having multiple self-contained islands exchange energy between each other on a very cost-effective basis, which can be, I was raised in Africa in places that had either extremely unreliable grid or no grid at all. I can see how this can represent a very attractive opportunity using purely renewables, and in some cases generators to provide cost-effective bottom-up electrification. Different paradigm like we saw in cellular in Africa or in Central Asia.
We're seeing that actually in our projects in India, what you just described about networking. A lot of the projects that we see, the funding for the microgrid comes from some sort of government subsidization or a government grant. And the challenge is, as the grid starts to get closer to those installations, do we abandon that investment and therefore stop all future grants? Or do we find a way to incorporate that into a kind of a cohesive system? And there are a number of implementations right now of network microgrids in the 100 to 1,000 watt range that are networked between villages. And when you network enough of those that you have sufficient capacity, like in the 0.5 megawatt range, you can actually attract private investment and get away from the subsidization.
And an interesting limitation of the current paradigm is you can't scale subsidies. At the end of the day, it's got to be cost-effective technology that wins the day.
And that's typically going to happen at some level of scale. You know, we looked originally at rooftop and how you would build a battery for household use, and what we felt if we solved the problem at the substation level, I get some aggregated costs and some benefits, but it's real difficult to do it on the nano scale, as you called it. So I think, especially if you're doing in developing countries, there's a lot of solutions we've seen where, you know, Johnny can go home and read his book at night, but there's not much there where the energy is large enough to start putting in critical infrastructure for true economic development and industry, education, et cetera. So our focus was if we can start building a larger macro grid to some extent, let's say 10 megawatt plus, it's got all the components that are pieced together, you put them in there, and then you can start really supporting the people that don't have power today, but also that will translate a hell of a lot easier over to the United States and the solutions we're trying to solve here.
I mean, it's an interesting thing when you start talking about networking microgrids together. It actually starts looking like a utility distribution system in a lot of ways. You'd say 10 megawatts, that's roughly a peak load on one of our distribution feeders. As part of our Irvine Smart Grid demonstration project, which is one of the ERA-funded projects that came out of DOE, we're looking at actually ways of how do you adapt the grid so you can more easily integrate these different renewables and storage. How do you put in the appropriate protection equipment? How do you hook all that together in sort of a seamless sort of networked method with cybersecurity wrapped around it, so you actually can obtain those benefits both for the customers and for the utility who's trying to serve the rest of the customers that don't have the microgrids.
One interesting opportunity too with microgrids is most of the loads that we're starting to see now from high efficiency motors, computers, lighting, tend to be DC by nature. And I think that microgrids offer a unique opportunity to start offering tremendous efficiencies in serving those loads by having parallelization of both a AC and a DC subgrid or microgrid and interconnecting those together. And I think you're going to see that occurring probably more in a data center world than some commercial applications, but eventually also for bottom-up electrification.
That's a good point.
So it seems like part of the challenge as we sit here is sharing information properly between different tech vendors and different stakeholders. So I also wanted to give you the opportunity to introduce the Microgrid Alliance as one of the newest industry advocacy organizations. What are your plans there?
Sure. So a number of years back, before the smart grid became really popular, we started an organization called the Gridwise Alliance. There are quite a number of members, and they actually saw a tremendous amount of change, including ultimately leading to part of the AARA grant, $4.5 billion towards smart grid, through the efforts, largely in part by the Gridwise Alliance. Because the microgrid now is, at least I deem it as an application of smart grid. I think that there's an opportunity here to take this industry and have a collective voice for what microgrids can do for the industry, both on a regulated side, on the utility side, and even on the commercial marketplace, and how the U.S. economy can really grow from this potential new opportunity, not only domestically but internationally. And so about a month ago, we formed an organization called the Microgrid Alliance. It follows the same kind of structure as a 501c3, but it's the same kind of structure that the Gridwise Alliance did, which is how do we bring our voice together, talk about the issues that are important, talk to the regulators, ask the regulators what they care about. If they start to think about making investments in microgrids or authorizing their utilities, what are the questions they ask? And how do we bring our industry together to organize our voice to be one place that they can go and get those answers? Certainly they can hire consultants to come up with those answers, but what we're trying to do is bring all the stakeholders together, the universities, the researchers, the utilities, the suppliers, and even the various agencies. So the Department of Energy has joined us. We've got over a dozen organizations now, very large organizations that all utilities work with. They are very interested in understanding, do we have a collective voice? And so we organized this. Be happy to answer any questions about this afterwards, but this is a way in which we can actually move this discussion forward in a collective way.
And I think I'd be also interested in hearing some voices in the audience and start our Q&A session. So whoever has a question, please go ahead. We have about 10 minutes left.
A little less than that. Yeah, I've been. Hello. Yes, I've been involved with microgrids with the Department of Defense for many years, and there's power electronics that were awarded in SBIR, where they use the off-grid or microgrid synchronization, and to be able to synchronize various current and voltage sources to within a tenth of a cycle. So that's being noticed now, and Sempra Energy has done some tests on that area to see the importance of it. So the technology is there now, and I've spent 20 years in the field of energy storage. So we'd like to, see some of this information being used by the Gridwise Alliance and the Microgrid Alliance and some of the IEEE P2030 groups. I think the biggest issue is getting the cell stacks to reach 400 to 750 volts, because you need that voltage to deliver 208 or 480 volts. And most of these storage systems I see on the market now are trying to start off at 30 to 90 to 100 volts DC, and they don't know how to series the stacks. So if they have to boost it with a boost inverter, you lose a lot of efficiency. I think that's the major issue I see.
Craig, is that a technological problem that you would be able to address?
We're already large, so I mean there are some issues of matching up inverters and the your voltage and current, but as a whole, you build your battery with that already in mind, so you know what the standard inverters are and you try to match up to them. It doesn't mean that there's not better ways, and we've talked before about those situations. The efficiency losses, in the grand scheme of it, in a microgrid, efficiency losses are a minor part of what is driving the economic value in this overall deal. It's going to be more of the interoperability and the function of the service that battery provides. So I agree. We'll take efficiency gains where I can get them, but it's not where our primary focus is when it starts looking at returns on investment.
Okay. I think there's another question over there.
Hi, Terry, you talked about the ability with the microgrid to squish this demand and capacity. And then you were talking about a grid. When you have a microgrid, you still have to plan for that needing capacity in this. But if you have something that's more reliable than, say, just a normal utility solar that has maybe not, completely squished, but isn't it slightly better than just your normal generation utility, just a solar out there? Or are you looking for something much better and much more reliable before you'd be willing to pay slightly more for something like that above just a utility solar plant?
I guess from a reliability standpoint, I would certainly hope that the microgrid was more reliable than the utility, because that's the reason they were probably putting it in. And if they didn't meet that requirement, then that was a failure. But You know, I think it's all about sort of how you kind of agree with that microgrid as to what kind of services they want from the utility when they're connected. And then we can plan around that based on sort of what that agreement is.
If I may add to the topic of reliability microgrids, you have to, hardware is hardware, it will fail. Things fail in the field. The key is to take a system approach that accounts for the fact that failure will occur and there's no single point of failure that can take the whole system down. So if you can engineer using an approach where failure does occur no matter what, the key is to always maintain things like voltage stability, voltage reference stability within certain ranges, safety, and ultimately taking into account failure.
More questions?
I have two more
I
questions,
see a
one
hand over
both
there.
up front.
Yeah, hello, Gupta, California, PUC. I have a question actually for Bob at Edison, and we're off the record, so you're fine. So
Sort of off the
This is
record.
Green Tech Media. You're on the record. I'm just kidding.
Just pretend. Okay. Your comments about the microgrid, it seemed like the presumption is that the microgrid, a customer owned or third party. And I'm wondering, you know, the first panel session we had was, there was a lot of discussion about resiliency. Is it possible for the utility to look at microgrid as a resiliency strategy and construct feeders in such a way that they would start approaching a microgrid and become more reliable? That way, is that a long-term strategy that's meaningful to look at, or are there some obvious drawbacks?
You know, we think we always look at the grid to try to maintain a reliable system. We do a lot of things to maintain the reliability, you know, from the way we detect faults to the way we switch out of faults to redundant paths. As I mentioned earlier, our Irvine Smart Grid demonstration, we're looking at looping circuits together so that if there's a fault, a smaller piece of it's affected. So microgrid could be one of those solutions down the road. I think when you look at the cost case we have to put together to put any kind of infrastructure in, that it just doesn't come up near the top of the list right now. I'm not saying it won't ever, but I mean today if we have to do that sort of, how do you improve the reliability of a feeder? There's other things that can be done to probably improve that reliability without having to go the full microgrid route at this point.
What if you needed to replace the entire feeder, though? If you compare it to the cost of replacing a feeder, wouldn't the microgrid win more easy there? So I'm thinking of the Borrego Springs project.
Okay, yeah. I mean, and the Borrego Springs project is a pocket of load on the end of some long lines.
Right.
Not typically our case. I mean, you have to look at it case by case, definitely do, and evaluate sort of what's the right solution. The majority of the Southern California Edison service territory is very urban, so you don't really have those long, isolated load pockets. There are some spots that are like that, but majority of them are not that case.
I think we have
One final question right here.
As a battery manufacturer, I'm interested in this whole discussion of cost and how something pencils out. And when we talk about the centralized distribution grid, there are so many inefficiencies, and someone said that subsidies don't scale up, but they do. If you look at the gas and oil industries and the subsidies, they're in utility scale distribution and transmission. So in terms of the microgrid, I'm just wondering what you might say in terms of the efficiencies achieved just by it being local. You don't have the transmission losses that range from 30 to 70%, depending on distance. And with regard to the subsidies and the utilization of resources, the centralized extraction and generation based on those resources and the environmental fallout, toxic fallout, the microgrid offers something very different that is about renewables and it's local and you don't have the transmission losses. So I'm just wondering, in the discussion of cost effectiveness, how does all that factor in? It's an open-ended question, really.
Well, I can offer a comment here. Microgrids will probably have a levelized cost of energy a little bit higher than the utility, but it's a much more stable rate of increase than the utility grade rate. We'll see that utility rates will rise much faster, and in a number of years, I believe that the cost of a microgrid installed solution for an end-use customer will be a much better deal. But that said, when you look at reliability, there's a number of factors that go into reliability. One is loss of revenue. And if you look at what Connecticut chose to do, they were the first state to come out with a recommendation for implementing microgrids. They did that in response to 2 weeks of outage from a snowstorm. And that was their kind of knee-jerk reaction to how do we improve the reliability of the utility grid. They said, let's just find another way, not with the utility. Well, ultimately, they ended up working with the utilities, but it was a knee-jerk reaction to a reliability issue. So microgrids at the state level, some states are saying we need to look at how do we improve reliability of our operation because of economic losses from outages that are occurring.
And that's a push on the commercial industrial users. I mean, it's more critical to the guy that's running in the middle of a semiconductor batch than it is the state losing revenue because of whatever the case might be. So we try to make that argument all the time. And what you're seeing is outside the United States, they definitely see that in India and China where they're starting to build very elaborate microgrids to be able, because their grid is unstable. And we don't have the luxury of having an unstable grid, but luxury. But in the end, what I do think is where you start talking about a smaller tethered microgrids where you got bidirectional power flows, and we've heard all the cool stuff about it, how that really vets out. I think there's a lot of more redundancy and reliability around a tethered microgrid system than there is an essential generation scheme. So I agree on that. The efficiency losses that you save by not going over transmission is somewhere lost in the loss of cost it's cheaper to install something big than something small. So I think they cancel themselves out.
All right, I think it's time to wrap it up and also time to thank the panelists. Thank you.
Good.
Go right into the next